8. HMS Vixen. Construction on the three-masted steam-powered gunboat, the HMS Vixen, began in 1864. Measuring 160 feet long, she was the first British Royal Navy ship with twin propellers. Like her sister ships, the Viper and the Water Witch, she was built as an experimental vessel. The Vixen displayed impressive turning abilities, but was much slower than other ships at the time, reaching a maximum speed of just 11 miles per hour. In 1867, she was nearly lost in the Irish Channel during a winter gale. All forward hatches were closed to prevent water from flooding in, but the men operating the furnace had to occasionally open them for ventilation purposes. When this happened, they were up to their ankles in water. The storm rendered the ship unsuitable for sailing on the open sea, so she was towed to Bermuda and repurposed as a floating defense battery for the Royal Navy dockyard. Naval records show that the Vixen sat in the waters off Bermuda from 1869 to 1892, with no officers assigned to her. Then, in 1896, she was deliberately scuttled near Daniels Head off the western side of the island. The wreck currently sits in crystal clear waters at a depth of just 33 feet, with one end poking out above the surface. It's since become an artificial reef and is now home to a school of fish. It's also a popular destination for divers and glass-bottom boats. 7. HMS Invincible. The L'Invincible was built in 1744 and began its career as a French naval warship, but it was captured by the British 3 years later during a battle off the coast of Spain. Having the ship in their possession represented a huge gain for the Royal Navy. The vessel was then renamed the HMS Invincible, and it was more advanced than the rest of its fleet. It was extremely fast, and it didn't have to slow down before turning. It also had a spacious deck that could hold more guns and carry more weight than the existing British ships of the time. The Invincible's design, known as the 74-gun vessel, became the template for the majority of the Royal Navy's warships until 1860, when the age of steam-powered vessels began. In 1758, the ship set sail from Portsmouth Harbour for the French fort of Louisbourg in what is now Nova Scotia, Canada. There were 690 military personnel and civilian crew members on board, as well as weapons and other fighting supplies. But the Invincible ran into trouble just 4 miles from its departure point when the anchor became stuck and the vessel's steering jammed. The crew managed to raise the anchor, only for it to become wedged once again, this time under the bow. As a result, the ship ran aground on a sandbank. It was refloated, but heavy winds blew it straight back towards shallow waters and it ran aground a second time. The crew was rescued, but the Invincible sank beneath the waves. It was rediscovered in the 1970s and was soon given the distinction as the best preserved 18th century warship in UK waters. The wreck site is protected from human interference by law, but the strong currents and the effects of time have taken an inevitable toll on it. In recent years, archaeologists have retrieved a large collection of artifacts from the site, which are now on display at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. 6. USS Independence. The US Navy aircraft carrier USS Independence served in World War II between 1943 and 1945, playing a critical role in the American naval offensive in the Pacific. In 1946, it was one of over 90 vessels that were used as a target fleet for atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Codenamed Operation Crossroads, the project aimed to test the effects of a nuclear explosion on a naval fleet. Like many of the other ships that were used in the experiment, the Independence was damaged during the tests, at which point it became the focus of decontamination studies. The Navy deliberately scuttled the vessel in 1951, but it was lost due to imprecise and conflicting records. One document indicated that the ship was 300 miles off the coast of California, but in 2015, researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found it just 30 miles from the shoreline near Farallon Islands. The damage to the USS Independence from Operation Crossroads was apparent, but the ship's hull and flight deck were mostly intact at the time of its discovery, and as it turns out, the vessel was only partially decontaminated before it was sunk. There's detectable radioactivity at the site and is bound to leak into the water as the carrier continues to rust. Researchers are currently considering how they might be able to safely travel to the wreck and retrieve parts for further study. 5. Mars. Built during the 1560s, the Swedish warship Mars was the leading ship of King Eric XIV's fleet. The 230-foot-long vessel was one of the world's largest warships at the time and had a reputation for being one of the fiercest. It was also named after the Roman god of war. Just 4 years after the ship was built, it caught fire and exploded during a battle in the Baltic Sea. Somewhere between 800 and 900 German and Swedish sailors died in the disaster as Mars descended to its watery grave, taking a treasure trove of gold and silver coins with it. After spending years researching its possible location, a team of divers found the wreck in 2011 off the Swedish island of Åland, where it currently sits at a depth of 246 feet. Researchers confirmed the ship's identity as the Mars, based on its unique cannons and other discoveries at the site, including a collection of silver coins minted by Eric XIV of Sweden. Speaking to National Geographic in 2014, experts described the wreck as the best preserved vessel of its kind, representing the first generation of Europe's big three-masted warships. In the words of maritime archaeologist Johan Ronnby, Mars represents a missing link that's helping to fill the gap of knowledge among experts when it comes to 16th century warships. Raising the wreck would be expensive and risky, so experts have agreed to leave it on the seafloor while using state-of-the-art technology to study it from the surface. If you were a pirate during the mid-1600s, what would you name your ship? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. Gribshunden. Built during the late 15th century, the Danish warship Gribshunden was the flagship of John, King of Denmark. Armed with 11 iron cannons, the imposing 115-foot-long vessel was a symbol of Danish military power. So, it was the natural choice for King John's voyage to Sweden in 1495, when separatist leader Sten Sture the Elder began threatening to break away from the Scandinavian Kalmar Union to pursue independence. During the voyage to Kalmar for planned negotiations with the Swedes, the Gribshunden caught fire and sank to the bottom of the Baltic Sea while anchored off the Swedish port town of Ronneby. King John wasn't aboard at the time, but many of the 150 crew members died during the sinking. The wreck was located in the 1970s, but it wasn't positively identified as the Gribshunden until 2013, more than 500 years after it plunged to its watery grave. It's considered to be the best preserved shipwreck of its era, and quite possibly the only ship of its kind from the time period. In 2015, a wooden figurehead depicting a sea monster was retrieved from the wreck site. Measuring 11 feet long, it once sat proudly atop the ship's prow. The creature resembles a cross between a lion and a crocodile and could reflect the ship's name, which translates to grip dog or griffin hound. According to Marcus Sandek-Jer, who led the recovery effort, the figurehead is unlike any other artifact from its era. In the future, archaeologists hope to raise more of the wreck in hopes of learning more about 15th century shipbuilding techniques. 3. HMS Gloucester. The end of the English Civil War in 1649 brought the fall of the monarchy and the installment of a parliamentary government. Amid these changes, both foreign powers and royalist supporters targeted the country's maritime trade. To counter the growing threats, the new leadership began building up the navy and ordering the construction of new ships. Included among the expanded fleet was an ornately decorated wooden frigate called the Gloucester. The vessel was launched in 1654 and was one of around 30 large warships that doubled the size of the English fleet, effectively rendering the Dutch navy obsolete. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the vessel became a Royal Navy ship and was renamed the HMS Gloucester. Over the years, it was involved in numerous conflicts, including the Anglo-Spanish War and the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. In 1682, Gloucester's crew was tasked with transporting Duke of York, James Stuart, to Scotland to retrieve his pregnant wife. In addition to being next in line for the throne, James was the accomplished admiral of a naval fleet that had participated in several of the tumultuous era's major battles. During the voyage, the ship struck a sandbank off the English seaside town of Great Yarmouth. Just the night before, James had argued with several of the ship's officers about which course to take. They were aware of the sandbanks off the eastern coast and had compromised on a route that ultimately sent the Gloucester straight into danger. As the ship came to a halt along the shallow sea bottom, a hole was torn in its keel. It began to take on water and sank less than an hour later. The Duke survived, but the disaster claimed somewhere between 130 and 250 lives. A team of divers found the wreck in 2007, but news of the discovery was withheld from the public until 2022, when its identity was finally confirmed and measures were taken to protect it. In a statement, maritime historian Claire Jowett described it as the single most significant historic maritime discovery since the raising of the Mary Rose in 1982. A collection of artifacts from the site will be on display at the Castle Museum in Norwich until September 2023. 2. USS Monitor. After finding out that the Confederate Navy was stepping up its shipbuilding efforts with the creation of the ironclad CSS Virginia, President Abraham Lincoln ordered the construction of an ironclad warship that he hoped would supersede the enemy's capabilities. Built in just 3 months from start to finish, the USS Monitor set sail from Brooklyn for the first time in 1862. The 179-foot-long ship's career was extremely short-lived, but it still became an iconic part of American military history. During the Battle of Hampton Roads in Virginia in March of 1862, the Monitor exchanged gunfire with the CSS Virginia, the same vessel that the Monitor was built in response to. After celebrating Christmas on the ship later that year, the crew set out for Beaufort, North Carolina, where they planned to meet up with 2 other Union vessels and proceed to Charleston as part of a blockade. The sailors knew the Monitor wasn't seaworthy, but they did as they were told. While being towed out to sea, the ship encountered a brutal storm. The vessel began rolling uncontrollably and was taking on so much water that the crew was unable to pump it out faster than it was coming in. There was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the Monitor from sinking, so the crew was left with no other choice but to abandon ship 16 miles off Cape Hatteras. 47 sailors were rescued by the ship's tugboat, but 16 others died at sea. The wreck was rediscovered 111 years later, in 1973. To protect it from looters, the site became part of the country's first designated marine sanctuary 2 years later. Efforts to raise the ship began in 1995 and led to the recovery of the Monitor's anchor turret. The remains of 2 sailors and a gold wedding band were also uncovered from the wreckage. The sailors were given a proper burial, and the salvage parts of the Monitor were conserved and put on display at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, where a replica of the ship is also on display. 1. The Äpplet. In late 2021, maritime archaeologists discovered the wreck of a 17th century warship off the Swedish island of Vaxholm. It was later identified as the Äpplet, the long-lost sister vessel of a famous warship called the Vasa. Commissioned by Swedish King Gustav II Adolf, the Vasa sank just minutes into its maiden voyage in 1628. Its designer had no experience with armed ships, and construction was rushed, resulting in an overweight gun deck and other design flaws that led to its quick demise. The Äpplet set sail the following year for the first time, in 1629. It was designed by the same shipbuilder as the Vasa, but with improvements to make it seaworthy. Built for the Swedish military during the 30 Years' War, the Äpplet carried roughly 1,000 men to Germany on its maiden voyage. Unlike its sister ship, the vessel remained in service for 30 years. In 1659, Swedish officials scuttled the Äpplet along with 9 other Swedish warships as a barrier to prevent enemies from reaching Stockholm by sea. The wreck was found as part of a research program called the Forgotten Fleet, which is an ongoing effort among archaeologists to find lost ships. By studying the differences between the Äpplet and the Vasa, experts hope to learn more about the evolution of Swedish shipbuilding. 9. SS Maheno. The SS Maheno was built during the early 20th century, and the 400-foot-long vessel originally operated as a luxury ocean liner in the Tasman Sea, transporting passengers between New Zealand and Australia. It had first, second, and third-class accommodations, and a carrying capacity of 420 passengers, who all had access to a dining room, smoking room, and a music room with a grand piano. The Maheno was converted into a hospital ship for servicing injured military members shortly after World War I broke out in 1914. It had 8 wards, 2 operating theaters, 5 doctors, and a full staff of nurses and army medics. The 5,000-ton steel-hulled steamer ferried wounded soldiers to and from various places throughout war-torn Europe, Egypt, and New Zealand. After the war ended in 1918, it was turned back into a passenger ship and returned to commercial service. In 1935, the Maheno was decommissioned and sold to a Japanese shipbreaking yard. Just a few days into its final voyage from Sydney to Osaka, the vessel's tow line broke during a cyclone. Crew members failed to reattach the line, and the ship began to drift. It washed ashore at Fraser Island, and the 8-man crew set up camp while they waited to be rescued. Help finally came a few days later, and while the crew members survived, the Maheno was left in rough shape. After several failed attempts to refloat it, it was left sitting along the shoreline. It was listed for sale, but nobody bought it, and what's left of the rusting hulk remains at the site to this day. It's since become an iconic part of the landscape, but it'll eventually deteriorate and disappear, and visitors are banned from going onto the wreck for safety reasons. 8. The Sea Belle. One of the first ships to wreck at Fraser Island was a wooden schooner called the Sea Belle. She departed from Rockhampton for her home port of Sydney on April 2, 1857, but never arrived at her destination. The ship's fate was a mystery, but rumors began to circulate about a white woman and her 2 children living in an Aboriginal village on Fraser Island. 2 years after the wreck in 1859, authorities commissioned local ship owner William Harry Sawyer to search for the alleged survivors. Apparently, the Sea Belle had wrecked on the notorious Breaksea Spit sandbar. The captain, crew, and passengers traveled in lifeboats to Fraser Island, where they were met by Aborigines who allegedly killed all the men but spared the women and children. Acting on tips from locals, Sawyer and his crew discovered 2 fair-skinned girls living in an Aboriginal community along the island's coast. Assuming that the girls were survivors of the shipwreck and that their mother had died, Sawyer took them to Sydney. The ship's records later revealed that there was a little boy and a girl on the Sea Belle, but not 2 sisters. The girls may have been albino Aborigines who were mistaken for being white, or they could have been biracial. But it soon became obvious that they were members of the community they were taken from, and their stories took a sad turn after they were forcibly relocated to Sydney. Unfortunately, one of the girls died in an institution shortly after arriving, and the other died 20 years later from consumption. It's now believed that everyone traveling aboard the Sea Belle died at sea. 7. Stirling Castle. The Stirling Castle was built in New Brunswick, Canada in 1829. It initially travelled from Scotland to Sydney under John Donmore Lang, a Presbyterian minister, writer, and historian. He was also one of the first advocates for an independent Australian nation. Along with him came the founders of the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts, including members of what would become one of early Australia's most prominent families, the Petrys. In 1836, the Stirling Castle left Sydney for Singapore under the command of Captain James Fraser. However, it didn't get very far before it struck a reef and ran aground off Queensland. The ship came to rest on Great Sandy Island, which is known today as Fraser Island. James Fraser, his pregnant wife Eliza, and the rest of the vessel's crew camped out on the beach while attempting to repair the Stirling Castle. Eliza ended up giving birth, but unfortunately her baby didn't survive. A few days after the wreck, the group was taken in by the local Butchulla people. Fraser died in their custody, but historical accounts contain conflicting claims about the man's cause of death. Some say he starved, while others contend that the Aborigines killed him. Eliza and 3 other survivors were rescued 7 weeks later by Royal Navy Lieutenant Charles Otter. Upon her return to England, Eliza shared the story of her ordeal and quickly became a celebrity. Her fame inspired the renaming of Great Sandy Island, and by the 1880s it was widely known as Fraser Island instead. Modern historians suspect that Eliza's accounts of her experience were exaggerated, and that these stories helped fuel hostility toward Aborigines. According to some survivors' narratives, the group was treated well by the Butchulla people, who went out of their way to ensure their health and safety. 6. Waiwera. There's no definitive count of how many ships have wrecked off Fraser Island, but there were at least 23 recorded wrecks between 1856 and 1935. One of them was a schooner called the Waiwera, which wrecked off the coast of the island in 1905. Few details are available about the ship itself. According to an article in The Argus, a former newspaper based out of Melbourne, the ship was on its way to central Queensland, where it was scheduled to pick up some timber and water along the Burnett River. The Waiwera was manned by a captain named D. Thompson. His 10-year-old son, also named D. Thompson, first mate C.M. Scott, and 10 Aboriginal crew members. During the trip, the ship encountered what the article described as very heavy and dirty weather. it was driven into heavy breaker waves despite the captain's best efforts to turn the ship around. The captain and his son, the first mate, and 11 others boarded one lifeboat, while 5 crew members boarded a smaller vessel. They had no time to grab food, water, or any other provisions before getting into the boats. In the meantime, the Waiwera sank, and everything on it was lost. The survivors eventually decided to beach their boats at Waddy Point on the eastern side of Fraser Island. From there, they began the 25-mile walk to the nearest lighthouse. 5. SS Aramac. Built in Glasgow, Scotland in 1889, the steel steamship SS Aramac operated as a passenger and cargo ship under the Australian United Steam Navigation Company, making regular runs between Melbourne and Cooktown. The first major incident involving the ship happened during the Maritime Union strike in 1893. With the regular crew members on strike, the Aramac was manned by a non-union scab crew. While sailing near the entrance to Moreton Bay, someone rigged the forecabin with dynamite and set off an explosion in the middle of the night. The prime suspect was Australian revolutionary Larry Petrie, who at the time was travelling under the name George Frederick Howard. He was a known radical socialist, and he appeared on deck suspiciously quick after the blast to let everyone else know that he was in his cabin when it happened. Luckily, nobody was seriously injured and the Aramac avoided major damage. Petrie was charged with attempted murder, but he maintained his innocence and was ultimately absolved of any blame. In 1904, the Aramac crashed hard against the Breaksea Spit, a sandbar notorious for its shipwrecks. To avoid alarming the passengers, the crew initially acted like nothing was wrong. The vessel continued on for another 15 miles before the crew realized they could no longer conceal the emergency because of how bad it was leaking. Passengers were then loaded up onto lifeboats and took refuge on nearby Fraser Island. The Aramac was initially anchored off the coast of the island, but it was later towed to Brisbane for repairs. If you were on a sinking ship with no lifeboats, what would your instincts tell you to do? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. The Panama. The American sailing vessel known as the Panama arrived at Keppel Bay off central Queensland in February 1865 to drop off 150 coal miners who were on their way to the Peakstown mine. About a week later, the ship departed for Newcastle. Along the way, it repeatedly encountered strong winds and then a cyclone, which blew the vessel toward Fraser Island. The Panama struck the infamous Breaksea Spit and was beached at Rooney's Point near the northwest side of the island. 2 crew members tried swimming to shore, but only one of them made it to land with their lives. During low tide, the captain, several crew members, and the ship's passengers managed to reach the shore. The survivors later claimed that Aborigines came and took their belongings while they camped on the beach, prompting the captain, 4 crew members, and 1 passenger to flee in a lifeboat. They were picked up by a passing steamer and were returned to the wreck, where 1 crew member was rescued. Sadly, 3 passengers and 8 crew members lost their lives when they tried to escape in another boat. After visiting the wreck, timber entrepreneur William Pettigrew described it in his journal as being nearly all to pieces and said it was burnt. He also wrote that he took some dry wood for firewood, but that most of the ship was too wet to salvage. 3. SS Changsha. The British-built SS Changsha left Sydney for Hong Kong with a cargo of coal in 1884. With 119 passengers and 70 crew members aboard. Shortly into the journey, the 269-foot-long ship struck Sandy Cape Shoal off the northern tip of Fraser Island. It was refloated at high tide, but the hull was severely damaged, and the vessel was taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it. In a bid to save the lives of everyone on board, the captain beached the ship on the eastern shore of Fraser Island, just 5.5 miles south of Sandy Point. 7 Chinese passengers drowned when their lifeboat capsized in a swell, but everyone else was rescued. During the 1980s, Bruce McCullough and fellow diver Neil Black explored the Changsha wreck. McCullough collected some artifacts from the site and called a designated hotline to report his findings. He ultimately decided he didn't trust the state authorities to handle them with the respect he felt they deserved. Later, he told the Courier Mail that he got the impression they would put the items in boxes and forget about them. McCullough held on to the artifacts for 30 years, until his son convinced him to negotiate handing them over to the government. An agreement was eventually made to put the items on display at the Maryborough Bonstore Museum, and McCullough relinquished his collection. Fraser Coast councillor George Seymour said the artifacts were especially appreciated because they help tell the story of the Changsha, which is little known despite its significant role in Queensland's history. 2. MV Natone. The MV Natone's lengthy history began in 1919 when it was built in Norway as a fishing vessel called the MS Fainfjord. Over the years, the ship went by many names. It was called the MV Wyatt Earp from 1932 to 1939, while sailing under the command of the famed American explorer Lincoln Ellsworth. Between then and 1947, the ship served as an ammunition carrier for the Royal Australian Navy under the name HMAS Wongala. The vessel was then refitted for Antarctic voyages and was recommissioned as the HMAS Wyatt Earp. During its first trip to Antarctica, the ship encountered numerous problems and was deemed unfit for future voyages to the icy continent. During its final years, it served as a cattle carrier called the MV Natone. While sailing from Cairns to Brisbane in 1959, the ship encountered a cyclone and ran aground on some rocks at Rainbow Beach, a small tourist town in Queensland that's considered to be Fraser Island's southern gateway. Miraculously, everyone survived and made it to the beach, with some crew members riding on hatch covers as huge waves carried them to shore. In the end, the Natone was deemed unsalvageable and was left in place, where it broke up on the rocks. 1. SS Marloo. The SS Marloo was a steel steamer that was built in England in 1891, and she operated as an Italian luxury liner early on in her career. In 1895, the ship was sold to the Adelaide Steamship Company, which used it as a merchant vessel. While traveling from Mackay, Australia to Brisbane in 1914, the ship struck a submerged reef in calm waters off northern Fraser Island. The Marloo took on water fast, so the captain deliberately beached it on Fraser Island shore. Thanks to his quick thinking, the entire crew and all 38 passengers were rescued, although he was later blamed for failing to exercise due caution while navigating in an area with known hazards. Green tomatoes and bottles of whiskey littered the nearby beach, but most of the vessel's cargo was salvaged. Attempts to refloat the ship were abandoned during rough weather, and the Marloo broke apart and sank. Tides and erosion occasionally reveal what's left of the wreck, which sits about 1,000 feet off Orchid Beach in 30 feet of water. If you owned your own private island, what would you name it? Let us know in the comments below. 5. RAF Fauld. The Royal Air Force Fauld is a former underground munitions storage site. Located in Staffordshire, England, it was chosen for its central location on the island. It was out of reach of the enemy, and they believed they'd be safe from bombing. The RAF Fauld stored between 3,500 and 4,000 pounds of explosives in underground mines. It also stored MC-1 gravity bombs and other ammunition. Since the RAF had a staffing shortage, the camp was forced to hire 200 Italian POWs. A large number of them were assigned to positions at the weapons storage facility, where they handled live bombs and carried out risky duties that required ingenuity and expertise. On Monday, November 27, 1944, the depot exploded, leaving a crater almost a mile across and 400 feet deep. Houses and churches as far as 6 miles away were damaged by flying debris, and a reservoir's retaining walls gave way, causing a flood that destroyed a factory and killed 37 employees. A nearby farm also suffered after losing 200 cattle. Though accurate records were never acquired, it's believed that about 70 people were killed and many more were wounded. The explosion was picked up on seismographs all over Europe and was heard from 37 miles away. An investigation revealed explosive results. It turns out that an inexperienced airman tried removing a detonator from a live bomb with a brass chisel instead of a wooden one, like the safety policy instructed. Surprisingly, only a third of the RAF Fauld complex was destroyed, and the disaster could have been much worse. But the rock pillars and concrete barriers designed for this kind of emergency held up against the explosion and prevented a chain reaction. 4. The Great Emu War. In 1918, the Australian government was suffering during the Great Depression and unable to pay the pensions of World War I veterans. Instead, they created the Soldier Settlement Program. With the goal of introducing them back into civilian life, the program gifted over 5,000 vets a plot of land. From there, they were able to make a living by cultivating wheat and raising sheep. Located northeast of Perth, the area was called the Wheat Belt. It was one of the most remote parts in the entire country. It was inhospitable, barely livable, and roads were non-existent. Many people simply called it Emu Country. In 1922, making a living here was about to get even more difficult. Emus started invading the farmland, and they loved the wheat. The emus were a destructive force the veterans weren't used to dealing with, so they turned to the government for help. The Australian government reclassified the emus as vermin, removing them from the protected species list. But the veterans were short on ammunition since they were barely getting by thanks to the collapse of agricultural production. By 1932, over 20,000 emus were eating crops and roaming about the land. The vets threatened to leave the land as it was, while demanding to be moved to a better spot unless something was done about the giant birds. The government was faced with a tough decision: eradicate the once protected species or pay money to relocate the veterans again. Needless to say, they chose the cheapest option and called on the military to draw up a plan. The first shots of the Great Emu War were fired on November 2, 1932. Soldiers pulled up with machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammo. They launched an open attack, which failed miserably. Newspapers covered the story for months. It was revealed that the birds were too big, too tough, and too fast to kill. On top of that, most of them escaped. At an impressive 5 feet tall and a hefty weight of 100 pounds, this bird is not just known for hiding its head in the sand. Emus can sprint at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, making them a formidable foe. Soon, the military was waging a full-blown war against them. The Australian military fought the birds daily for almost an entire month. Plan after plan ended the same: embarrassing defeat. Soldiers were reported as saying that they believed the emus were capable of making strategies and launching counter-offensives. They were able to get close enough to the emus and shoot from a few different directions, but their casualty number was very low. Unfortunately for the Australian military, the emus adapted. On December 10, 1932, 38 days after losing to birds, the military retreated after being urged to do so thanks to jammed guns, broken down vehicles, and a low death toll of a few hundred emus. The Australian government decided to try a different tactic. They offered free ammunition to the veterans whenever they needed it, and put up a bounty for emus. Clearly, a far better policy than the last. Everyone was mostly happy with it. Everyone except the Australian military, who had to live with the embarrassment of a fully dressed military being beaten by animals, that is. How would you have defeated the emus? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe while you're at it. 3. Maginot Line. One of the largest lines of physical barriers ever built by man, was also one of the biggest blunders of World War II. The French government swore to defend its northeast border with Germany from any more attacks after the tragedy of World War I. The Maginot Line, named for then French Minister André Maginot, was built along the country's border, consisting of fortifications and weapons. The French spent almost a decade constructing the 300-mile network, which was supposed to be impenetrable. There were fully equipped underground military outposts with mess halls, hospitals, amusement areas, and railway lines, behind intimidating pop-up gun turrets, tank traps, and 12-foot concrete walls. Their goal with the Maginot Line was to be able to go up against anything the Germans launched their way. Whether it was poison gas or artillery fire, they wanted to make sure they were prepared. They were confident in the line because Germany was under the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, but they didn't think the peace would last long. Germany was obligated to make financial reparations, disarm, surrender land, and give up all of its overseas colonies. Not to mention no standing army, no air force, and building weapons or any sort of armored vehicles were allowed. Germany withdrew from the Treaty of Versailles in the early 1930s after Hitler and the Nazis grew in power. As the French finished building their fortifications, the Germans were getting ready for battle. They were establishing a fleet of bombers and armored vehicles for their mobile blitzkrieg strategy, which was Hitler's plan to prevent a prolonged war. Throughout the campaigns, Hitler and the Nazis used this strategy to destroy their opponents as quickly as possible, using armored tanks and air support, as well as maneuverable forces. In 1936, the Maginot Line was finally finished. Future Prime Minister Winston Churchill was impressed and claimed it cannot be broken at any point. Sadly, for the French, one minor detail was overlooked. The line only extended from the Alps in the south to the north, where France bordered Belgium. It was not extended to the English Channel in the north because, according to the French, passing through the Ardennes forest in Belgium was unlikely. Turns out, it was more likely than they thought. Overall, the Maginot Line proved highly ineffective and costly. Despite a solid set of concrete bunkers, artillery guns, and even railroad connections for supplies, it still didn't stop German forces from bypassing it, allowing them to invade Belgium via the forest. Germany used its blitzkrieg attack, which caught the French off guard. Eventually, British troops left mainland Europe at Dunkirk after being forced to leave. After that, France had to defend itself. The Maginot Line was designed as part of a greater plan to withstand an impending German invasion. It's still regarded as one of history's unsuccessful mega-projects, since it had little to no impact on the Battle of France. Since they were able to simply go around the Maginot Line, the Germans expelled the British expeditionary forces from the European continent, captured Paris, and completely forced the surrender of the French government. 2. Retaking Kiska. In order to retake the last enemy strongholds on American soil from Japanese troops, who succeeded in capturing a few US islands, Kiska and Attu Island in June 1942, American and Canadian forces conducted an amphibious assault on the North Pacific island of Kiska in 1943. The mission, which was codenamed Operation Cottage, happened on August 15, 1943. Pre-invasion bombardment of Kiska was intense. Throughout the month of July, the 11th Air Force detonated 424 tons of bombs on Kiska. The occupation of US territory was another blow to American morale and helped solidify American resolve. A US naval armada launched 330 tons of shells at the island in the same month. A force of 34,426 soldiers, including 5,300 Canadian soldiers, were expected to invade the island. Knowing about the battles being fought in the South Pacific and the empirical nature of the Japanese military, Allied forces prepared for a hard and bloody battle. What the Allies were unaware of was that the Japanese on Kiska Island had slipped away in the dense fog of the Bering Sea. American forces, 7th Infantry Division, 4th Infantry Regiment, 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, and 1st Special Service Force descended into Kiska on August 15, 1943. The next day, the Canadian 13th Infantry Brigade arrived. The invasion forces fought their way inland through dense fog and unrelenting artillery bombardment for 2 days. There were several casualty reports, firefights, and sightings of elusive Japanese snipers. The American and Canadian forces suffered 32 casualties, 28 Americans and 4 Canadians were killed, as well as 121 illnesses and wounds, despite the fact that they thought they were fighting the same enemy. The USS Abner Reed DD-526 struck a mine, injuring 47 men, in addition to the 71 sailors who were killed or reported missing. There had been 313 Allied casualties by the time the island had been examined and declared safe. Both the Americans and the Canadians were killed by their terrified allies' friendly fire, others by mines and timed bombs planted by the Japanese, by unintentional ammunition explosions, vehicle accidents, unexploded bombs on the tundra, or sneaky booby trap explosions. The cherry on top is that the Japanese garrison consisting of 5,183 men, left on July 28, 1943, 3 weeks before the Allies arrived. All of these played their part in the embarrassing battle against an empty island. 1. Black Hawk Down. Mogadishu, Somalia, was the site of the Battle Mogadishu, or Black Hawk Down. It was part of Operation Gothic Serpent on October 3rd and 4th, 1993. The conflict was between UN peacekeeping missions, backed by United States troops, and Somali militiamen, led by the Somali General Mohammed Farah Aidid. The UN's original mission was to supply food to Somalia in order to alleviate the effects of drought and famine. With a full civil war going on in the country at the time, it wouldn't be long before their focus shifted in a different direction. They later changed their mission to restoring a government and establishing a democracy. The UN forces were involved in the inspection of Aidid's arm depot to make sure the war crimes weren't being committed. During the inspection on June 5, 1993, the peacekeeping forces suffered massive losses after the Pakistani contingent was attacked. It was assumed that General Aidid and his men were responsible, and the hunt for them began. On July 12, 1993, US troops in Mogadishu carried out a raid on the Abdi house as part of their effort to capture Aidid, which resulted in the deaths of a handful of men. Aidid retaliated with his first targeted killing of American military personnel on August 8, 1993. Soon after, former American President Bill Clinton dispatched Army Rangers to take Aidid into custody. On October 3, 1993, the plan was to go into an aid-controlled section of Mogadishu, grab the targets, and get out. The entire operation was only supposed to last an hour. Instead, they found themselves in a standoff that lasted all night, which led to a rescue operation the next day. The goal of their mission was achieved, but the victory was dismal at best. During the battle, Somali militiamen used RPG-7s to shoot down 2 of the American Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. More American troops were sent in to protect the crash survivors and their aircraft. On the morning of October 4, 1993, a column of the UN's armored vehicles fought their way to the stranded helicopter crew and the troops. They painstakingly fought their way through, and they eventually rescued their stranded brothers. Public outcry led President Clinton to withdraw the remaining US forces. The ill-fated mission went on to affect how the United States interacted and intervened in not only Somalia, but other regions as well. The battle changed American foreign policy and finally resulted in Mission UN's removal in 1995. The number of casualties that the Somalis suffered isn't precisely known. Estimates range from 3,000 to 4,000. Initially, 5 American casualties were reported by the Pentagon. That number later totaled 18 KIA and 73 wounded. At that point, they hadn't seen anything like that since the Vietnam War. Thanks for watching. Which of these crazy military disasters surprised you the most? Do you think they could have done anything differently? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.